The Daily Derech. We are walking the path of holiness.
Hello, everybody. This is Rabbi Marcus Rubenstein. Welcome to the Daily Derech, a special project of exploring Judaism, the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, and the Rabbinical Assembly. Today is the 6th day after Shabbat Kodesh, the 21st of Iyar, 5786, corresponding in the secular calendar to Friday, May 8th, 2026. We will read Parashat Behar-Bechukotai this coming Shabbat, and it is the 36th day of the Omer. Let's begin. Menorat HaMaor. All right, today we'll spend our last day of the year learning Parashat Behar, and we're going to talk about the Jubilee year for one last year. We're going to continue thinking about the lessons that the Jubilee year teaches us. According to the Me'am Loez, he states that there are really many great mysteries about the Jubilee year that we can't even fathom as human beings. It goes beyond human intellect, and I think this is true for all mitzvot. In general, that we can't just believe that mitzvot are the reasons that we can understand for those mitzvot, but we should believe that every mitzvah has a reason that we can't quite understand, which is why we have to follow the directions for the mitzvah and the rules, even if we don't understand the reason necessarily why. But I think the reason he probably states this with the Jubilee year in particular is because economically it's really troubling. The fact that you'd forgive all these people's debts, and how is the society going to continue on in this way? So I think he's backing up to say there are great mysteries we don't understand. But he's going to back that up with some ideas that we can understand and that I think are really beautiful, too, in particular. So the first idea he presents about the Jubilee year that I think is quite beautiful is it changes the way in which we see property. Right? It changes the way we see what we have. We've talked over and over again about the land belonging to God. The Jubilee year shows that even all of our property belongs to God, not just our land, but the money we have, everything. And it all eventually will go back to God once again. And so what he brings it in the case of a negative of a thief. Right, a thief who keeps stealing and who has the habit of stealing things from other people. And what the thief will realize from the Jubilee year is that all of the possessions, even if he steals them, will eventually go back to their rightful owner. They'll go back in the end to sort of a reset setting, and that everything really belongs to God in the end. So in the end, all the thief will be left with is his transgression, right? And obviously the justice that entails that will eventually come from that, but not any of the property he gains through that acquisition. And so hopefully it actually helps people to change differently. I think the way we might see this in our society today is not necessarily in the case of it's true in the case of a criminal, this might help. But also even those of us who aren't criminals necessarily, who are stealing things necessarily, how do we lead our life, right? Do we lead our life pursuing, trying to get as much as we possibly can because we live under some false illusion that we're going to have it forever? It's not the case, right? It's all going to go back to God, and all we'll be left with in the end is Ma'asim Tovim, right? Is the good deeds we've done, and the decisions we've made in our lives. So very, very important to know what truly is eternal in our life, what truly lasts forever, and what doesn't. It is very elusive in this world. And he switches really from this to talk about lifespans. And this teaching I thought was really unique and really interesting. I never really thought of the Jubilee year this way until the Me'am Loez brings it up. But he says that just as there are 7 cycles, there are 6 years, and on the 7th you rest. And then there are 6 sabbatical cycles, 7 sabbatical cycles, and then there's a Jubilee year. So too with human beings, right? What he says is that we live until up to 70, right? We should be working. We should be trying to gain money, get what we need for our families, everything like this, and be very involved with the world. But he actually suggests that once we get to 70, that we should take a step back. Now, I think it's important to understand that this was almost a 200, 300-year-old text. So lifespans were a little bit different back then. So I would probably move that year up to maybe 80s, 90s or something like that nowadays. But still, I think the lesson is pertinent, and it's obviously different for different people and their health and everything like this. But he basically says that like once we reach this quite old age, we should turn away from the matters of this world and turn to matters of the world to come. Because we understand that in the end, everything that we've gained in this world we won't be able to bring with us to the eternal world, right, when we pass away. And in the end, that the public will be able to gain access to the things we have. I mean, if obviously our descendants will hopefully be able to have the things we have, but a lot of it also, a lot of the contributions we've made, especially to the world, more than just our physical property, but all the contributions we've made into this world, whether professionally or in whatever way, go to the next generation, and we don't have it. The public does. So in the end, he almost compares passing away and sort of the passage of time, the rite of passage of going through older age, as like this matter of Jubilee, right? That there's this Jubilee that goes on, and that person should focus on learning Torah, doing mitzvot, of course, and really think in preparing themselves for the world to come, to know that their actions will be judged. And it almost reminds me a little bit of sort of what happens in the Hindu world, that I've at least learned a little bit, that like, there's a one way of living in the middle of one's life, and then there's another sort of spiritual passage people go into to become sort of a mystic or a hermit at the end of their life, because they are more close to eternity. Now, I don't think we should necessarily go that angle, right? We're not Hindus, but I think this has an interesting parallel to it, that we need to switch views if we keep trying to live the same way we lived in the middle of our life. At the end of our life, it's not productive, and it only will upset and anger us at the end. But if we make this, I think, productive switch, there could be some real meaning into it. There could be really something beautiful in this idea. And I think seeing old age, and seeing being closer to death per se, as sort of getting closer to the Jubilee year, and seeing that death as a redemption, as a freeing of all property and a redirection of what everything belongs to, is a very healthy way to look at that point. And I it's nice to see this within Jewish tradition. Mishnah Torah. All right, today we're going to do and finish up our learning here of the foundations of the Torah. And we're going to end it on chapter 6-9. Now, of course, there's more halachot in this section, but I'm really only trying to bring halachot from the section that would make sense to us in a 5-minute audio section, and also are applicable, I think, really applicable to our lives in a very practical way. So here in this last halacha is a really interesting case of divine names. And I think this is important halacha, but it also tells us about the nature of divine names and how we should think about it. So these are divine names where it's really in doubt of sort of when we see these divine names in the Bible, who they are referring to necessarily. So the question, I think the overall question here is the holiness in the name itself, or is it in the way it's being used? We've already seen in previous episodes in this area of the Mishnah Torah that, if a heretic, for example, writes the word Yud-K Vav-K, right, you actually might have to burn it, right? Because even though it is the holy name of God, it is still, its holiness very much changes based on who is writing it and what they believe. And we actually see that here, I think, as well. This is more of an extension of that concept, but into the biblical characters themselves. So he says all the names that are said about Abraham. So he's going to give different stories here, and whether the names of God that are used in the text are considered holy or not. Meaning, and if they're holy, as a very specific meaning, they can't be erased, they can't be thrown out, they must be buried, everything like this. So he first says all the names in the Avram passage and the angels are sacred. Now, why is he saying this? Because Avram actually says to the angels, Adonai, if I have found favor in your eyes, right? So it seems like he's referring to the angels when he says Adonai. So maybe this isn't necessarily a divine name, and he's seeing them right now as human beings, maybe. So maybe that's not really a divine name. And of course, here what the Rambam says is that they actually, all those usages of Adonai there are actually sacred and can't be erased. This also has to, of course, do with Avraham's character. And that's really proven, I think, here by sort of what happens next. Then he tells the story of Lot, and sort of a similar thing happens. And according to our tradition, these are actually the same angels that went to Abraham and to tell him that he would have a child, are the same angels then that go to warn Lot in Sodom. So what we see there is those same names that are used by Lot are not considered holy. Why? Because the way in which he uses them and the way what Lot believes, and it really says a lot about what Rambam thinks about Lot's character, and also sort of what happens after he uses those names, right? Horrible, horrible things happen in the story of Lot, which we don't necessarily need to go over now, but they're really disgusting things. So I think in this reason, this is why Rambam rules here, or at least the Talmud rules, and Rambam obviously is just repeating it here, that they are not considered sacred and they can be thrown out. So this is a really cool example that even the same names themselves, we know they're the same angels, the same creatures, same things of some sort. Even then, sometimes those names will be holy, sometimes they won't, depending on the people who use them. So he goes through a couple more passages. There's a passage in the book of Judges about the tribe of Benjamin when they do something horrible to a woman, to a concubine, and then there is civil war because of that between Benjamin and the other tribes. And they use sacred names in that, saying, should we go to war? Should we not go to war? And the Rambam does say they're sacred here, because what we see is that they are the rest of the Israelites reaching out to God to say, should we go to war with another tribe of the Jewish people because of the horrible things that they've done? So when they reach out to God, that really is God in which they're speaking to at that moment. And I think there is a little bit of, this is what needed to be done at this time. It was a very hard decision to attack one's fellow Jew, but what they did was so horrible and terrible that there needed to be justice in this regard. There's also another passage in the book of Samuel about a person named Micah. It's not Micah the prophet, but a different Micah. A Micah story where there's this guy named Micah who seems to be doing weird idolatry, some weird idolatrous practices, but to God, right? So he actually mentions Hashem in the passage. And what we're told, according to the Gemara, that these are not holy names, because again, he's using the right names, but he's using them specifically for idolatrous practices. So once we use even though it's the right name, because you're using it for idolatrous practice, it actually changes the kedusha. It changes the holiness and the status of the name itself. There's also, he mentions the story of Navot and Navot's vineyards, another story from the book of Kings. And this time, basically Queen Jezebel, King Ahab's awful wife, tells lies and says that Navot was cursing God, and she uses the name Elohim, right? And so even though her claim is false, because she's addressing himself over a crime that could at least be real, her usage of God is then Elohim here is discerned to be Kodesh. And then Shlomo, right? So whenever the name Shlomo is used in the book of Songs or Solomon, usually, and this is not considered a divine name, it's just a name. But here it's considered a divine name. And this really goes to how we interpret Song of Songs within a rabbinic context, where, Shlomo is really elevated, the king itself, and that the whole thing is seen as a divine love story between God and Israel. And so actually every time Shlomo appears in the text, it's considered a divine name that cannot be erased. This is based off of a midrash that the idea is Shlomo's name comes from the idea of he was named after God, the Melech who was shalom to him. And so this is where we actually get the idea, the Melech that was peaceful to him, which is God, right? So we get the idea here that actually shalom itself, and saying shalom in some context could be a divine name. So that's what gets the strange halacha in the Gemara of sometimes you actually can't say hello to people in certain places because hello involves saying shalom aleichem, and shalom might be interpreted in some context as a divine name. Very interesting argument. Lastly, we have the book of Daniel, where the word king is used over and over again. Usually it's referring to human kings. So in this case, Of course, if it's referring to human kings, it's not considered a holy name. One time Daniel says Melech Malchaya, right, which is the king of kings. Obviously, that phrase is considered holy and cannot be erased. Now, I think this is very interesting here of, what is, we sort of said that only the 7 names are holy, but now it seems to be expanding into sort of how the terms are used themselves. Very, very interesting. And again, expanded here. So I would say when you get to these names, I would just be careful, because you might find other halachic authorities that would rule differently or see how this would work. So I would be strict. If it comes up with a case of trying to throw out these passage of the Tanakh, I would just not do it and genize it. There's no problem with genizing something that might not actually need to be genized. It's better meaning to be buried. It's better to bury than not to bury in that regard. Menorat HaMaor. We're going to continue learning this introduction to the first candle, the first major section. He's going to dive into the topic of ta'ava now, of lust. And of course, he's really going to talk a lot. He kind of goes back and forth throughout this section between jealousy, lust, pursuing kavod or glory. He's kind of going to go back and forth, and that's, I think, natural, because they're sort of all related and that's why they're in the same Pirkei Avot, right? The 3 things that remove a person from this world. So he begins this particular passage by saying that lust is divided into different things, just like he did with jealousy. He's also going to do with ta'ava now, lust. So he first talks about the idea of someone who lusts after harmful foods, whether they're unhealthy foods or it's too much drinking, alcohol or drugs or something like that. People who sort of lead their life as around feasting, around eating, around pleasuring themselves in whatever way they possibly can. Not only are they wasting their time, right, and just feeding their own lusts, but they also spend time around people who also do that same thing, right? So they end up becoming friends with people who do that, and that also then leads them to more transgression and emptiness. It's not only the act itself that causes the damage, but it's also the people who you end up relating to and being in relationship with, because you you tend to make relationships with people around the people you hang out around, and the one you share similar activities with. And so your values then will be shaped by them. And this will cause, obviously, lots of issues within one's actions and within one's character, within one's personality. He says here it causes severe illness and causes him to die before his time. This seems to be his sort of go-to line, and this is the idea that our actions really do affect our lives. I've interpreted this over and over again as saying that it might not be a direct physical illness here, but it's certainly a psychological illness, and it certainly causes harmful psychological, mental illness, spiritual illnesses here. And it certainly makes life less worth living, because life, is less meaningful then. And so dying before his time is not just necessarily lifespan, but it's also how meaningful those years are, which is really important. And he bases this off a verse in Proverbs 21:25 that says the desire of the sluggard will kill him, right? So the person who is constantly wanting things that are pleasurable to them, and they constantly want those things, and that desire itself will end up killing the person, right? Sluggard is the way it's translated in English often, but atzel, like lazy, also a lazy person. And it's interesting also here to sort of see what's lazy here, because is this person really like lazy? I mean, they're really working very hard to get the pleasurable things in life. Is that person necessarily lazy? I would say they're misdirected, maybe. But I think that also changes our conception of what laziness means in Judaism. It's not just like that you're tired all the time and you don't really want to do anything. It's specifically you don't want to do anything in terms of mitzvot. And you're not driven by larger values, but you're really just driven by, what's the easiest pleasure I can get in the moment. And I think that's in some ways a much better sort of understanding of laziness. It's misdirected values, misdirected drive, not misdirected energy, which is, I think, actually very illuminating. He then talks about the desire for lusting for women. Obviously, this is directed here at men, but it certainly goes back both ways, like just lusting sexually after, whatever sex you're attracted to. and he quotes a verse from Proverbs 31:3, in which Solomon says, "Do not give your strength to women." Right. So this sounds very, when you read it, it really sounds very sexist. And it might be in this context, but I don't think it's really meant that way. I think really what is being said here is don't give your sort of strength, your energy, just to pursuing the sex you're attracted to, but rather, don't put so much energy into that all the time. That also is a trap that will lead you to emptiness and, of course, remove you from this world. Finally, he talks about craving and desiring honor and authority and power, what we would call power here, and yet the person doesn't attain them, and that causes extreme frustration. And even if they could attain them, even if they attain somewhat of whatever power, one, we know that you're never going to get the power and the authority and the sovereignty that you actually want to have. You're always going to be upset that you don't have more, and it also empties you out. And even if you get what you want, it removes you from this world. And just as craving after honor and authority, as the Pirkei Avot says, removes you from this world. It makes life not living. So very, very important. It removes your identity of who you're supposed to actually be in this world, according to God's vision. So very, very important here. And I think, again, the more we internalize these might seem like simple lessons. Oh, I already know this. But really ask yourself, are you doing this in your life? Are you really taking these things to heart? What's an area that you can work on in your own life to make sure that you are doing this less, you're being driven less by these values? And if we're not applying that to ourselves, then it's not really Torah at this moment. It's just interesting facts we're learning. But really, the design of this is that we actually apply this to how we live our lives so that we can become better people. Well, that's it for today, everybody. Thank you so much for listening to the Daily Derech. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to email me anytime at rmr@templeofaaron.org. Thank you so much for listening. There are so many people to thank, and you can look in the show notes for that. And also, if you want to know and see any of these texts in the original, we actually have that too. You can actually find that in our episode description. So look in each of the episode descriptions, and you'll find that information right there. Thank you very much. Have a great day, everybody.